today's 7th Circle Gaming, we analyze a more recently released game and something of a change of pace here for us on the channel, Atomic Heart, or as nearly as I can translate, Atomnoye Serce from Russian. Feel free to correct me on that translation in the comments section below, but either way, let's move on and to our first screen, which is, as always, the full disclosure. And you're welcome to pause the video now and read through all of these at your leisure, or if you'd prefer not to, we'll move right into the first screenshot. And in our first screenshot, we aim to illustrate, as we usually do here, the game world on its own. And now we've also selected this particular screenshot because it illustrates the early game world and a bit of the story interludes. Now, of course, in this particular interlude, it's presented purely as an audio log, not necessarily a cutscene. And because it is also early in the game, we don't see a lot of the user interface. We'll see that a bit more in our second screenshot. But we did want to illustrate that the game will be presenting its story through audio logs. Now in our second screenshot, we are going to be showing more of what the in-game world looks like, as well as the user interface. Notably, we have some new icons added on the lower left and the lower right, and then the upper right-hand corners of the screen. On the lower left, we see our typical location for the health meters and ammunition counters. On the bottom right is another sort of counter or gauge, which we aren't going to go into too much detail about because that could potentially be a spoiler. Likewise about the icon in the top right-hand corner of the screen. We've also chosen to blank out the quest tracker, which is on the top left-hand corner of the screen, because that could also be potentially a story spoiler. However, we would just point out that this is from a later portion of the in-game world, where the player has moved out into more of an openly explorable area. And with that, we're going to move on to our next screenshot, which is somewhat of an interesting screenshot, so we're going to talk about it very briefly. As with a lot of games of this sort of exploring, crafting, stealth action genre, there is something of a detective mode, for want of a better phrase, or a scanning mode. And this is how Atomic Heart has chosen to visualize its detective mode, or its scanning mode. We would just draw your attention to the gesture being made by the player character on the left-hand side of the screen, which is obviously for the benefit of the English-speaking world, because that gesture would have little meaning in the Cyrillic alphabet. So then, with that, we won't say anything more, because that would be getting too much into linguistics, and we'll move on to our next screenshot. Now, another major portion of this roughly 3 or 4 part game is the upgrade tree, and what we're looking at here is the upgrades that are going to most directly affect the player character. These are going to be purchased with in-game items that are found around the world, or looted from deceased enemies. Now, players are going to find that some of these will be locked by progress, or discovering a different item, discovering a blueprint, or what have you, but some of these are going to be available from the start of the game, only limited by the number of resources that the player has collected. Now then, before we give away any spoilers, we're going to move on to our next screenshot, which is the the second or possibly third of the major portions of the game. Obviously, as we can see, there's a crafting element to the game, which is evidenced by the icon for crafting on the top left-hand corner. The player can craft various weapons that they have uncovered or discovered blueprints for, and all of those weapons can be upgraded in a number of ways. Also, which require their blueprints to be uncovered or discovered from the in-game world, in addition to having the required resources to craft those items. If this is getting awfully complicated, well, let's move on to our next screenshot. And this is the final of the major portions of the in-game of Atomic Heart, which is inventory management, which shouldn't be all that unfamiliar to players of similar games. But what we mean to say is that players have a limited number of inventory slots that they must manage or juggle between what is an essential item right now versus what could potentially be an important item later. Now, obviously, this can be expanded through the player upgrade tree that we saw earlier, but the player is only going to start out with the inventory slots that they're seeing here. And with that ends our screenshots, and we're going to move on to our first chapter proper, which is, as always, immersion. And here, Atomic Heart has earned an 8.5 out of 15, which is certainly above average. The game will be attempting to utilize presentation to get players invested into the game world. It's presented in a first-person perspective, which gives it a little bit of a bonus, because obviously anything that the player character sees is also what the player sees. It is a realistically rendered world with some science fiction elements and the foreign language aspects, although neither of these should be all that unfamiliar to players that have experience with either science fiction or the James Bond spy genres. Likewise, the game will be attempting to utilize challenge to get players invested into the game world, mostly in the form of combat and the infantry management and those limited resources that we mentioned earlier. The game will also be attempting to utilize player agency to get players invested into its game world, again relating to that limited resources, locked by progress, but the ability to potentially make those choices about which items to craft and which upgrades to purchase versus which items are or which upgrades are not necessarily going to be required. More on that later. Finally, the game will be attempting to utilize story to get players invested into the game world, and there are going to be some choices, dialogue options that players will have, but just in all of our evaluation sessions, we haven't seen any of those to make a significant difference, so just be aware of that. Now, there are no real statistics that the game is going to present players with, so we haven't included statistics focus as a potential immersive aspect to the game. So, primarily what's going to be carrying this is that presentation and the challenge aspects of the game. And with that, let's move on to difficulty. And here, Atomic Heart has earned a 6 out of 15. There are only basic difficulty options. These are referred to as story, normal, and hard. Lovely. Likewise, those game options are not described terribly efficiently. The game has opted for a paragraph rather than bullet points. The game can, however, be played reasonably well with a keyboard and mouse or gamepad. However, we did uncover that the keyboard and mouse did have some slight benefits, namely that activating that detective mode is a little bit more efficient with the keyboard and mouse versus a gamepad. However, it's entirely possible that some of the jumping puzzles are going to be more easily completed with a gamepad rather than a keyboard and mouse. The user interface, on the other hand, is not particularly cluttered. However, again, there is some self-discovery of commands required. Certainly in all of our evaluation sessions, we had to consult with the settings menu on a couple of occasions to discover what buttons we would need to push. However, those negatives haven't impacted the score for difficulty. So the game has earned, once again, a 6 out of 15. And what about, though, the lasting appeal? Well, here Atomic Heart has earned a 5 out of 15. There is only cosmetic DLC at present, although that could be changed later. We can't necessarily say, we don't have that information. There is no mod support for the game expected. We don't expect that to change later on either. Now, the story may appeal to some players enough to get them to play through to the story end. Combat is not unsatisfying, however, some players may find it frustrating, others won't. It is entirely possible to play through the game and make different upgrade path choices or play in a different difficulty settings. Likewise, players could choose to make that a challenge run and choose to complete the game under-leveled or under-equipped. On the other hand, the game is story-based, and that story doesn't change significantly from playthrough to playthrough. And for what it's worth, though the game does support play sessions for as long as the player has got the patience or the time available, provided it is their first playthrough of the game. And with that, let's move on and compile everything into the overall score. Overall, Atomic Heart has earned a 6.5 out of 15. On the high points, the game does play reasonably well with keyboard and mouse or gamepad. The story may appeal to some players and not others. The game world is fairly relatable, especially to players that are particular fans of science fiction. And on a bit of a subjective statement, so have those grains of salt ready. The game could be said to punish failure to fully explore and loot, if they may find themselves unintentionally under-equipped or under-leveled as they move on to the later phases of the game. Likewise, it is entirely possible that there is an optimal upgrade path or an optimal crafting path, and that there again players are going to be punished if they don't have the exact upgrades or the exact items crafted that the game believes that they should, or that they don't make the correct decisions about what items that the game provides. So, overall, the game has earned a 6.5 out of 15, which, for those that are interested, is below average, but it's not terrible. And with that, there really isn't anything more to say about Atomic Heart. If you did make it all the way to the end, thanks very much for watching all the way to the end. We do appreciate that. We look forward to seeing you on the next one, and from 7th Circle Gaming, goodbye.